Now that you learned the basics of relationships and how important they are, it is time to speak about normalization and denormalization. Normalizing a data model means adding more tables and more relationships, while denormalizing a data model means removing relationships by enriching tables. Denormalizing correctly a data model is an important skill you need to acquire in order to become a good data modeler. In fact, as we are going to see, a denormalized data model is slightly easier to browse, but sometimes normalization is needed in order to compute correct values. Let's look with a demo what we mean by that. In order to understand what normalization and denormalization are, let's start with an empty pivot table. On this empty pivot table, we can put the sales amount and then divide it by using the category name and subcategory name from the tables that contain the value. As you can see, we have one table with the category and another table with the subcategory. This is because in the AdventureWorks data model, this is the physical structure. And it is more evident if you look at the data model from inside the Power Pivot window. There we have internet sales, dim product and dim date, and then a chain of relationship that starts from dim product and reaches dim product subcategory and then dim product category. As I said, this is the physical representation of the model. But from the analytical point of view, we might want to have data in a different shape so to make browsing easier. You can look that the dim product subcategory and dim product category have a single column each. And when you browse data with Excel, it is somewhat hard to search for columns in the pivot table fields because there are so many tables. So it might be a good idea to take the values of the category name and subcategory name from these two tables and bring them in the dim product table, which is something we can do by using Power Pivot and the DAX language. To start denormalizing our model, we need to go in the Power Pivot window, which was open on the diagram view, and we will add two calculated columns to the dim product table. So we need to switch to Data View, search for the dim product table, and then we go to Add Column. We will create a new column in the product table that contains the subcategory name. To do that, we need to use the related function. Related is able to follow any chain of relationship from the many side to the one side and grab the value of the related row. So we use related English product subcategory name, and you see that the value looks empty, but if you go near the middle of the table, you see values computed. There are many products without category. Finally, we can rename this column with its proper name, which is subcategory. Once we have denormalized the subcategory, we can follow the same procedure to denormalize the category. When we write related dim product category, English product category name, Power Pivot follows the chain of relationship jumping 2 steps in order to reach the table. Finally, we rename it as category. Now we have 2 columns with category and subcategory directly inside the product table. And we might want to create a hierarchy out of that. So we go to the dim product table, we select a category, then subcategory, and finally English product name, right-click, and choose to create a hierarchy. We need to give to the hierarchy a proper name, which might be categories. And now we have in our dim product table all the columns which are needed to correctly browse the products. You can see in the pivot table that removing category and subcategory from the rows, we now have in the dim product our categories hierarchy that already contains category, subcategory, and the product name. and it will be easier to find because it is where it should be under the product table. The pivot table field list contains now dim product category, and dim product subcategory. But because of the denormalization we did, the two categories tables, so dim product category and dim product subcategories, are no longer needed because their content is completely moved in the dim product table. So we can go in the Power Pivot window and hide them. To hide a table, you can simply select it, right-click, and choose Hide from Client Tools. This will not delete the table, it will only make it invisible in the pivot table field list. If you then go back to the pivot table, you now see in the pivot table fields that we only have 3 tables visible: dim date, dim product, and fact internet sales. The content of category and subcategory is moved inside the dim product table, and the browsing is much easier now. As you have seen, we have used the Power Pivot model and the DAX language to perform denormalization. But there are other options for denormalizing a data model. One of them is that of using SQL. In fact, here we have 3 tables, 2 of which are hidden. But we might want to have an easier model to work with, and we can do that if instead of just loading tables from the database, we load SQL queries. To do that, we can simply reopen the connection, and instead of selecting from a list of tables, we decide to write a query, as you learned in the previous chapter. We don't want to write our SQL by hand, so we can use the designer, and among the tables we say that we want the dim product table. We don't want all the columns of dim product, so we just want product key and then the product name and maybe the color. And we select the 2 other tables, which are dim product category and dim product subcategory. As you learned in the previous section, you need to set up the correct chain of relationships, which is not always inferred in the correct way by the engine. We don't care about this at this point. We simply use the default relationships. Just click on OK to look at the query. And now that we have a query, we load it, and it contains the products, the category, and the subcategory already denormalized in a single table. To go on with the demo, we can simply remove, well, first we rename the table to a meaningful name, and then we can remove dim product subcategory, and dim product category, and replace the 3 of them with that products table. So we start with dim product, then we remove subcategories, and then we remove categories. And we only need at this point to create a relationship between the fact table and our products table. The data model is even easier to look at in the Power Pivot window. In Excel, in the pivot table field list, now we only have dim date, fact internet sales, we need to check all, and our product table. From there, we can select category, subcategory, and product name if we want. The browsing of the model is much easier. It is always difficult to choose whether it is better to denormalize using DAX or using SQL. What is important is that denormalization is a common process that you should follow in order to create a model which is easy to analyze. Then the choice of doing that in SQL or in DAX highly depends on your personal taste.